Thank you, Martin. I'm really delighted to be here in Newcastle. I think that the subject of education is a universal one because we've all been educated, but it's also a very local and particular one. And the project that Martin just was kind enough to mention, which is about recapturing the experience of universal secondary education in the last 60 or 70 years, is trying to recapture that experience at a very granular local level. And so I have some postdocs who are sort of fanning out around the country doing local studies, and one of those studies is in Newcastle. And the postdoc who's been responsible for this emailed me earlier today and said, are we going to use the Newcastle Wordle? And unfortunately, I'm not going to use the word Newcastle Wordle. And in fact, I won't have anything to say about Newcastle because we are only just processing all of this stuff. And what I'm talking about today is the subject of a book that I'm publishing under the same title, The Crisis of the Meritocracy, next year. And it really predates our project on secondary education. But if you invite me back to Newcastle in a few years' time, I will tell you more about secondary education in Newcastle, and I will show the Newcastle Wordle and explain to you what it is. Though actually you can go and find it on our website, so Secondary Education and Social Change. Anyway, starting disappointingly, not about Newcastle. The history of education, despite not being a very sexy subject, generates an awful lot of myth. Like the myth that grammar schools drive social mobility, or the myth that comprehensive schools drive social mobility. Actually, neither is very important to most people's social mobility. Or the myth that Britain has had a terrible technical education system and ought to imitate, well, Germany. I could go on. But why does the history of education generate so many myths? In part because it is a universal subject. We all play a role in that history. We all have our own story. And in a familiar psychological frailty, we tend to project our own story onto others, making ourselves more representative or more exceptional than we in fact are. But also in part because education does matter so much. Uniquely so in the past few generations, when for the first time in history, everyone has been guaranteed a secondary school education. Before the war, only about 20% of teenagers had any exposure to secondary schooling. And now a majority are experiencing higher education, whereas before the war that privilege was accorded to 2%. Whereas the other day we reached, for the first time, that famous 50% participation rate. So only in the last few generations since the war, our grandparents and parents, has everyone been exposed to more than a minimal training in the 3 Rs. And it does matter. Educational institutions have taken on many of the functions formerly carried out in the workplace and in churches, of taking children and making them into adults, of helping young people make the transition from family to society. In asking them to perform these socialization functions, we put a lot of pressure on our schools. We put them on the front line of social change. We ask them to deal with all the social problems that habitually infest the teenage years, to grapple with issues of which older people are unaware, and to prepare young people for futures we can hardly predict. So our hopes are heavily invested in them, as they are in our young people, and we need stories about them to tell us how our schools have performed and how they might do better, thus the myth-making. Today I'm going to address another myth that I haven't even mentioned yet, one that will allow me to say more about how much and why people have come to care about and to invest in education over the past 70 years. This myth revolves around these 4 dignitaries and many others of their ilk. They're the politicians who are held to be responsible for getting us this mass education society we now live in. Brad Butler at top left, the architect of the Butler Act, which made secondary education free and compulsory for all after 1944. Tony Crossland at top right, who abolished the grammar schools, or at least most of them, in 1965, thereby creating the possibility, at least, of wider progression to O-levels, A-levels, and higher education. Margaret Thatcher, unmistakable, bottom left, who, apart from snatching the milk in the early 1970s, is supposed to have made possible that progression through her reforms in the 1980s, raising standards in state schools. And finally, Tony Blair, bottom right, who set the 50% target for higher education that we reached this year. They are all formidable figures in British political history, and undoubtedly all took a close interest in educational provision. But the myth that I want to attack is that they were responsible for the extension of education to more and more people. I want to suggest instead that they could only respond to popular demand for more and more education. The motive force, that is, was not the heroic initiatives of educational reformers who get their names attached to these acts of parliament, but the incessant and growing expectation from the electorate that the state would provide more and more education over time. Even when they thought they were leading or shaping demand, I will argue, the politicians were most often trailing sadly behind it. So you can't blame or credit Tony Crosland for abolishing the grammar schools, which he didn't do, or Tony Blair for making half of all young people go to university, which he didn't do. You have only yourself to blame or credit. And that's the case I want to make in the next 45 minutes. So let me first sketch out some reasons why I think popular demand has counted for so much in determining the amount and shape of education on offer, and why this was so, especially in post-war Britain. And then I'm going to go on and illustrate this through three particular policies. In some respects, Britain was like most European countries in the middle of the 20th century, around the time of the Second World War. It was not only newly democratic, adult men didn't get the vote until 1918, adult women not until 28, and one person, one vote not until 1948. Its state education system was almost entirely limited to primary education. As I said, only about 20% of the population had any experience of secondary education before the war. And therefore, primary and secondary education were two quite separate systems. State primary education for the masses, and secondary education, much of it fee-paying, for a small elite. There was no ladder of opportunity from one to the other, or even the thought of one. Higher education was available only to a tiny handful, and not even universally used by the social elite. It's an interesting fact, for example, that only one of the prime ministers between the wars went to university, Stanley Baldwin. On the other hand, Britain was not, as is sometimes said, backward in these respects. It actually offered more years of compulsory state education before the war, 9, than any other European country. And this is just a chart that I've adapted from Martino di Orengo, showing how many years of compulsory education European countries required in 1938. And as you can see, Britain stands alone at 9, most other countries 7, 6, or 8. And then poor Portugal, 3. Although, as I've said, in all of these systems, these were years of compulsory education in primary schooling, not in secondary. And they weren't intended to lead further. After the war, all countries expanded educational opportunity greatly, and there was a degree of convergence, so that other countries caught up to some extent, although Britain still requires more years of compulsory education or training, that is 13 now, between the ages of 5 and 18. All countries eventually provided universal secondary education, and all countries expanded their higher education provision too. It was clear across the developed world that a modern nation needed an educated population to ensure equal citizenship in countries that all now had universal suffrage, to provide the skills for an increasingly post-industrial economy, a knowledge economy, a term that came into use in the late 60s, and simply to equip people to live in a modern society that increasingly requires formal knowledge and abstract thinking. All governments across the developed world, right and left, authoritarian and libertarian, both sides of the Cold War, provided mass education, though they gave highly varied reasons for doing so. Some special circumstances after the war, however, gave popular demand more weight and more visibility in this drive to mass education in Britain than elsewhere. First of all, state education in Britain had, since its origins in the early 19th century, always been provided with a tender concern for local and especially religious sensibilities. A liberal state like Britain was more cautious about imposing on people on their freedoms of religion and expression than bolder, more centralized states than Prussia or France. So state education was firmly assigned to local authorities rather than central government, and in that sense was closer to the grassroots from the very beginning. There was no national curriculum until the 1980s, something that still astonishes the French when you tell them that. And local authorities and even individual schools had considerable freedom to determine what was taught, when, and to whom. Then there were the special circumstances of the 1940s themselves, the war and its aftermath. The Second World War built up considerable popular expectations of a New Deal, in terms of state provision of Social Security, guaranteed minimum living standards, universal benefits, the package that we call the welfare state. Popular support for this welfare state was uneven. Trade unions were suspicious of income controls and other wage-related benefits, preferring free collective bargaining. And there was no minimum wage, just as there was no national curriculum until the 1980s and 90s. The most overwhelming support, however, was for universal entitlement to health and education. These services, uniquely, were seen as not only important to ensure fairness and greater equality in society, but virtually as a right of citizenship. And again, I think this is somewhat unusual in Britain compared to other European countries. And therefore, provision in health and education had to be universal, and increasingly, it had to be as equal as possible, while still, in the case of education, being delivered locally. That's a tough one. Now, it took time after the war for these expectations of health and education to build up. We're so accustomed now to treating the NHS as a national treasure that we forget it too took time to build itself into the affections of the people. And the same applied even more to education. Primary education had become well accepted, but changing schools at 11 and continuing to 15 or even 16 took some time to catch on. The connection between secondary education and citizenship only gradually became clear. Secondary education was where you learned to be an adult, a functioning member of society, an equal citizen in a world where civil equality now mattered a lot. You can see this growing awareness of the centrality of education in the way it rose up the political agenda, especially at the local level in the 50s and 60s. At the beginning of the 50s, education was mentioned in only about 30% of parliamentary candidates' election addresses. This was a period when national manifestos mattered a lot less than the individual addresses that local parliamentary candidates addressed to their local electorates. And education featured in only about 30% in the 51 election. By the end of the 50s, in the 59 election, it was mentioned in nearly all of them. And ever since, health and education have remained uniquely twinned at the top as the most important political issues in most electoral surveys. I mean, you've already heard, we've only had, 2 days of campaigning, 1 day of campaigning, and I think you've already heard schools and hospitals, more time than you can bear. Then there were reasons why most people's expectations of education were also growing by leaps and bounds in the immediate post-war decades. The importance of secondary education was that it had, up until this point, been basically the posh people's kind of education, the kind that led to clean jobs in shops and offices for the lower middle class, and to managerial and professional jobs for the really posh. For the 2/3 to 3/4 of the population in manual occupations, who expected their children to continue in manual occupations, secondary education hadn't been seen as necessary or even possible. And these expectations had begun to shift before the war, as more people, especially mothers, aspired to clean jobs for their children, and thus to secondary education, though few as yet achieved it. After the war, when secondary education for all became a civil right of the welfare state, new expectations, not only of more equal education, but of more equal life chances, more social mobility, as we would now say, began to form. And in fact, after the war, many more people were socially mobile into those kind of clean jobs in shops and offices. A hell of a lot more people than had ever progressed in this way earlier. My publisher told me when I was preparing my book manuscript that I had to put all of the charts and graphs at the end of the book, because they said ordinary readers will see a chart and a graph and they'll close the book immediately and run away. But you are going to disprove my publisher's thesis, because I've got lots of charts and graphs. And this one shows the distribution of men in the different occupations changing over time from 1951, immediately after the war, to 2011, the most recent census. And now I have a pointer, let's see if it works. Yeah. The green bar is basically the manual working class. This gray bar is the sort of intermediate classes, white-collar jobs, essentially, but also a miscellaneous group of people, self-employed, small businessmen, and so on. And then the brown and blue bars are lower and higher professional and managerial positions. And you can see that over half of all men are in manual occupations in 1951, and under a third today, and that's a huge change. This graph understates the degree of change because it tells you about the whole population, so it includes older workers as well as younger ones. If you looked at younger workers only, there'd be a much more, an earlier and more dramatic shift. And today, not very many young people are going into manual occupations, I mean, fewer than 30%. And by the way, just in case you're wondering, these come from national statistics, and every 10 years they update the classification of occupations so that what defines a manual and what defines a white-collar occupation changes, as you would expect, as new jobs come to play. So it's not reflecting an older categorization, it's constantly updated. So right after the war, over half of the adult male population were employed in manual working class occupations. More importantly, perhaps, they had grown up assuming they would be employed in such occupations and that their sons would too. But after the war, as you can see, that pattern began to shift. The manual working class began to shrink, and the professional and managerial classes in particular began to grow from 10% to 40%. A similar, though less pronounced shift was experienced by employed women. Among those born just after the war, more than half of all people experienced upward social mobility in their working lives. That's the natural conclusion you have to draw from this change in occupational structure. Most people are born into manual working class backgrounds, but at some point in their lives, often very quickly, end up in white-collar jobs or professional and managerial ones. Other forms of mobility were also common. Even those who remained in working class jobs were physically mobile, most to the suburbs. Our image of post-war tower blocks in urban situations is misleading, as over half of all council estates were in suburban locations. And parents were now much more likely to expect and to want their children to lead different lives than their own. What has been called psychic mobility, a movement away from a belief in a static towards a more dynamic vision of society. People expected society to be changing. They weren't resigned and fatalistic. And this optimism about the possibility of progress, personal and social progress, was closely tied to expectations of education. People associated in their own minds the promises of security and equality offered by the welfare state, the provision of more and more equal education, and their chances of improving their own and their children's lives socially and economically. This despite the fact, and this is a tricky one, again it involves a tricky graph which my publisher doesn't like, but it's a really important one, despite the fact that social mobility probably has little to do with educational opportunity. Rather, it has to do with the shift in the labor market in Britain, as in many other countries, away from manual labor towards service sector occupations. And this shows three groups of people born in between 1937 and 46, people born between 47 and 56, and people born between 57 and 66. So the pre-war, people born pre-war, people born just after the war, and people born, actually this is my cohort, I was born in 1958. And it's the proportions of each of these groups who were upwardly mobile. And as you can see, especially for the blue and the brown bars, the earlier groups, most people were upwardly mobile, over half. But what this shows is that it doesn't really matter how much education you had, whether you would be upwardly mobile or not. So this is people who didn't even have secondary education. That's not very many by the end. These are people who left school as soon as they could at 15. These are people who left school at 18. These are people who went to university. These are people who got a degree. And your chances of upward mobility were pretty much the same regardless of how much education you had. Now, your chances of being upwardly mobile were declining overall over time. But again, everyone was pretty much equally likely or unlikely to rise in the social order, regardless of how much education they had. I've always thought this was one of the most revealing and yet misunderstood features of modern British society. Social mobility, as experienced by most people, doesn't have much to do with education, though it may be becoming more important now and at the top end in particular. And this is why it doesn't really matter whether you have grammar schools or comprehensives. People are socially mobile in either condition. But these post-war generations wanted more education, regardless of what direct contribution it made to their occupational outcomes. They wanted it because it was a civil right, like a free and universal health service was a civil right, and because it seemed basic to a welfare state that promised security and prosperity for all after decades of growing inequality, the Great Depression, and the sacrifices of war. These popular demands never meant that education was purely a force for equality, but they did help to counteract the effects of a more stratified educational system in exacerbating inequality, which is why I titled my lecture and the book that I've just finished, The Crisis of the Meritocracy, because I want to argue that popular demand for more equal educational provision has for the last half century or more put a check on the unequal effects on education of meritocracy based on differential educational achievement, which might otherwise have been the dominant effect of education on the social order. So let me now turn to the main part of my argument, which is that these new expectations of a universal education service were actually more responsible for determining what the state provided than any initiatives of politicians. Politicians were, on the whole, responding to demand pressure, not stimulating it or creating it. And I'll offer three examples of the power of demand. First, in determining the transition to comprehensives, a process well underway before Tony Crosland put his name on it in 1965. Second, in determining the transition to mass higher education since the late 80s. And third, in determining not how many people studied, but what they studied, the balance between arts and sciences in schools and universities over the whole of the post-war period. So first, comprehensive education. Here we can see, in the 2 decades after the Second World War, a loose framework set up by politicians, starting with the famous Butler Act. There's Butler, looking like a walrus. We can see that loose framework gradually transformed to suit the needs and wishes of parents. The Butler Act itself did very little, apart from require local authorities to transfer all children to secondary schools at age 11, and then to provide free and compulsory secondary education for all to 15. Butler said very little about what kind of education children should get and in what kind of schools, so long as they were free. Unlike other features of the welfare state like the NHS, which were introduced by the post-war Labour government, the Butler Act was a product of the wartime coalition and represented a more bottom-line consensus. It was less controversial to delegate the details to local authorities, let them fight the politics out there. But it was also, as I've said, part of a long-standing policy that in a free society, central government shouldn't dictate terms of education to parents. On the other hand, local authorities weren't necessarily all that more responsive to parents. They were run by educational administrators who had their own views as to what kind of education was appropriate, and by penny-pinching local politicians who wanted to keep the rates down. So it took quite a long time for local authorities to do anything beyond the bottom line, which was to ensure that there were enough secondary school places for all children at age 11. For many, the transfer was merely a fiction, as all age schools survived into the 1960s in many places. And children simply moved from one part of the school to another at 11 and called that, oh, well, we're moving from primary to secondary. That was, by the way, much more common in this part of the world, in Newcastle and particularly in Gateshead, because the populations of these cities were shrinking after the war, and it was very difficult for local politicians to justify building new schools. For most, the easiest and cheapest solution seemed to be favored by central government, which was the so-called tripartite system: 3 kinds of schools for 3 kinds of children, grammar schools for the academic child. Most local authorities were already providing grammar schools for the top 10%, technical schools for mostly boys aimed at skilled trades, and so-called secondary modern schools for the rest. Tests at age 10 or 11, the famous 11 plus, selected out the academic and technical children, which left about 3/4 of the population to be educated at the new and cheap secondary modern schools. The secondary modern schools were either old primary schools, barely repurposed, or cheap new schools using temporary accommodation to house separately the children formerly kept in primary school. They had little obvious function, little obvious secondary character, offered few or no exams or qualifications, and remained institutions in search of a mission for their entire lifespan. But it quickly became clear that they did not meet parents' expectations, and their lifespan was short. For one thing, it was apparent already in the early 1950s that the 11 plus was desperately unpopular among both middle class and working class parents, but especially among working class parents, because their children were much less likely to pass the 11 plus and gain a grammar school place. I mean, middle class parents didn't mind the system so much because their success rates were very high. Before the war, most working class parents had little experience or expectation of secondary school for their children, relatively unaffected by grammar school selection. But after the war, it became universal. It affected everyone. With every passing year, there was more and more dissatisfaction when the state measured up its nation's 11-year-olds and found 75% of them wanting, consigning them to what were widely viewed as low-grade, low-cost schools. As early as 1954, when mothers of 8-year-olds born right after the war were asked, what kind of secondary school do you want for your children, 2/3 said grammar school. And yet only about 25% of those mothers would get what they wanted, mostly middle-class mothers. This was not a tenable situation. As one civil servant said at the time, if parents' wishes were to be regarded, and that's an interesting proviso. I mean, he actually said, if we were actually to regard parents' wishes, we wouldn't be able to continue with this ridiculous system of segregating children. But in fact, it was educationalists or politicians' views of what were good for them or what they could afford that seemed to prevail. Now, local authorities paid little attention to this swelling demand at first. I mean, they didn't really even know it. I mean, there was no obvious way for it to manifest itself. Local authorities were scrambling to provide any kind of schooling for all 11-year-olds and were neither able nor willing to contemplate providing the most expensive kind of school, the grammar school, for everyone. Nor did expert opinion think that parents' wishes should be regarded. The widespread expert view was that only a minority of children would ever be capable of benefiting from an academic education. And after all, as even the left-wing Labor Minister of Education, Ellen Wilkinson, put it, coal has to be mined and fields plowed. Interesting, actually, that, I mean, Ellen had been a communist 10 or 20 years earlier, and she was still conceived as one of the most left-wing Labor ministers, but she was, as herself a scholarship girl, a fierce beneficiary of the system of academic selection, and one of her chief arguments was that, you know, we would always need manual workers. Well, in fact, actually, it turns out we don't need coal miners and field hands, at least really to the extent that we did in 1946. Theirs was a static vision based on an eternal manual working class and a minority-educated middle class. Now, two manifestations of popular demand that mounted across the 1950s made it impossible for local authorities and experts to ignore the problem by the end of the decade. These were known respectively as the bulge and the trend. The bulge was what is now more often known as the baby boom. Family size had been shrinking earlier in the 20th century as the slump in war caused people to aim at fewer children to support. But the birth rate suddenly leaped ahead at the end of the war and continued to surge through the early 1960s. The bulge was itself evidence of the new optimism that most people felt about their future prospects, thanks to economic growth, but also to the security provided by the welfare state. There's a direct link between the baby boom and the welfare state. And although, of course, it did not have immediate effects on demand for education, it takes babies 6 or 7 years to grow up into primary school children, all the same, educational planners knew immediately after the war that the absolute number of secondary school places would have to start growing exactly in 1956. It's one of the nice things about educational planning. You can predict 11 or 18 years ahead. That meant new schools would have to be built sometime in the late 50s. Would these schools be tripartite, divided by the 11 plus? Or would they be cheaper and fairer comprehensives? And it was very hard for local authorities of any political complexion to contemplate new tripartite schools. The children of the bulge were children of the welfare state. Their parents were having more children because they had these high expectations of social security and social progress. Would 3/4 of them be happy to be relegated to second-class schools that offered no exams and few qualifications and no chance of progression to O-levels and A-levels and even possibly higher education? They would not. As even the conservative education minister of the early 60s, Edward Boyle, said later, I cannot from memory recall a single conservative with any interest in the subject who really favored building new grammar schools and secondary modern schools side by side in an expanding housing estate. This demand pressure for new schools on an unsegregated basis was exacerbated by a second source of demand, increasingly manifest by the late 1950s, which was called the trend. The trend was the growing demand by parents and students, among the majority educated in secondary modern schools, to stay on in school after age 15 and to sit exams, O-levels at 16 in the first instance. The tripartite system only provided places for at most 1/4 of all 16-year-olds who would be eligible to take O-levels at grammar school. but many more than that were showing themselves able and willing to stay on and sit exams. Demand for O-levels was growing at 10% a year in the late 50s and 15% a year in the early 60s. That's a whopping take-up rate growth, and that's at a time when the bulge meant that there were more of these children as well as a higher share of them. And a precisely similar trend was evident in Scotland, where by the late 50s already 35% of 16-year-olds were sitting the equivalent qualification. Not only were the assumptions of the tripartite system challenged by the trend, it was obvious that the 11 plus was only selecting a portion and a shrinking portion of the cohort evidently able to take and pass academic exams. That static idea that only 25% could ever aspire to take academic exams was being blown up. But also popular pressure for exams was overflowing the banks of the grammar schools and manifesting itself in secondary modern schools where they weren't supposed to be provided. Now, local authorities responded to the bulge of the trend in different ways, depending on their local politics and also on how much leeway the Ministry of Education would allow them. Nearly all Welsh and Scottish authorities and 3/4 of English authorities were already determined to abandon the 11 plus one way or the other by 1963. Most kept their existing tripartite schools, but began to open new schools on a comprehensive basis. Others, for example, Swansea or Wiltshire or Middlesex, just decided to start offering O-levels at secondary modern schools so that the difference between them and the grammar schools began to disappear. I mean, then they began to wonder, well, what's the point of an 11 plus if we're taking the same exams in both schools? The most popular response in Tory authorities was to move to a two-tier system, which allowed them to keep both existing secondary modern and grammar schools. The two-tier system, sometimes called the Leicestershire Plan after the conservative-controlled authority that pioneered it in the late 50s, abolished the 11 plus. It kept all pupils together in the same schools until 15. These were called junior secondaries. And they were mostly housed in the old secondary moderns, and they were comprehensives. Then anyone who wished to stay on after 15 could transfer at this later stage to a senior secondary school, which were based on grammar schools, where they could sit O-levels and A-levels. They were more selective, but they were able to expand to meet the demand for O-levels however much it grew. That is, anyone in a two-tier system who wanted to try O-levels could transfer. There was no test which decided whether you could. And you'll recognize this two-tier system as persisting today in many parts of England, including Cambridgeshire, where I live, where students stay in comprehensives to 16 and then proceed to a sixth form or an FE college. And that's a direct result of counties and authorities that adopted the two-tier plan in the late 50s and early 60s. The point here is that although the 1964 general election brought in a government ideologically disposed to comprehensives, and in 1965, an education secretary, Tony Crosland, doesn't look like a walrus, that seems to be confined to Tory politicians. He looks like a businessman, doesn't he? I'm trying to think of a good stereotype. It brought in an education secretary even more ideologically disposed to comprehensives. And they brought in a circular to all local authorities asking them to draw up plans to abolish the 11 plus. By that date, nearly all of them had already done so, and Crosland knew it. The circular, in fact, spelled out the various routes local authorities could take to comprehensive education based on the plans they were already adopting. Thus, the Leicestershire Plan was explicitly mentioned as one that would be favored by Tory authorities, and so were 11 to 18 comprehensives as already planned in every single Scottish authority. Of course, famously, a small number of conservative authorities resisted this, and some of them continued to hold out until Margaret Thatcher rescued them in the 1980s. And it took a while for those local authorities that did reorganize to do so. They had to build new schools, after all, and often close old schools. But the same long transition to comprehensive education happens in most countries that make this same move at about the same time. Sweden, for example, moved to comprehensive schools over almost exactly the same period, only to age 16, and actually became 11 to 18 comprehensive long after Scotland and Wales, and even after England had mostly got there. As we know, over 90% of state-educated students across Britain are today enrolled in comprehensive schools, and that figure hasn't changed much in the last 40 years. This transformation of the school system came about not because of Tony Crosland and his circular, but because after the war, parents had higher expectations for their children and higher expectations of the welfare state, and because between them, the bulge, the trend, and the welfare state caused the great majority of local authorities to begin the transformation before 1965. Okay, let me move now on to my second illustration of the power of popular demand, which takes us forward in two senses, forward to higher education and forward to the 1980s. To bridge the gap, I should say that, of course, the bulge, the trend, and the welfare state, which helped to bring about comprehensive education from the late 1950s, almost immediately thereafter put immense pressure on higher education as well. It's one of those things, again, you can plan. You know how many 11-year-olds you're going to have in 1956, you know how many 18-year-olds you're going to have in 1963, and actually by 1956, the planners also knew that the trend to more O-levels was leading to more A-levels and to more candidates for universities, so that the bulge and the trend together were already apparent well before 1963. And that's why more universities were already being planned well before the famous Robbins report of 1963. There's Lionel Robbins, the economist who wrote this report. What does he look like? An economist, I suppose. But more universities were being planned well before Robbins reported to government on the future of higher education. The famous plate glass universities of the 1960s are sometimes erroneously called Robbins universities, as if Robbins summoned them up out of thin air. But they were already half built, or like East Anglia, already open at the time of the Robbins report. From the point of view of popular demand, though, the Robbins report was important because it laid down in black and white the so-called Robbins principle, which the government was already committed to, but it committed it now in black and white. The Robbins principle, which was that everyone who was qualified for higher education by passing 2 A-levels, or in Scotland 3 hires, and wanted a place, should be guaranteed one. So there would be no rationing of higher education, so long as the trend continued towards more qualified students, they would have to be accommodated. And this embedded in policy, more or less right up to the present day, the idea that politicians shouldn't seek to engineer the provision of higher education, no matter how much they want to, but should principally respond to demand for it. Robbins made a series of projections based on the bulge and the trend about how many places would be needed for the foreseeable future. And the Robbins report is full of these charming hand-drawn graphs, which I have to say make me very sympathetic to the people who have to draw them up, because I can do an Excel graph in about 5 seconds. And God only knows how long it took a technical draftsman to put together these graphs, especially when they're on a log scale. This isn't on a log scale, but anyway, it's filled with these touching graphs. But they're all graphs projecting into the future and telling government what they were going to have to do for not just for the next 10, but 20, 30, 40 years. In fact, the furthest projection that Robbins made is only now, in a few months, going to be reached, because it was, the projections went up in some cases to 2020. This one, I think, only went up to 1985, but elsewhere in the report there are projections to 2020. And actually, with some exceptions that I'll get to in a second, they were pretty accurate. Robbins' projections were very accurate for the rest of the 60s. The bulge of the trend of the welfare state, as well as the provision of more places in universities and polytechnics, ensured that the proportion of 18 and 19-year-olds who progressed to higher education grew from under 5% at the beginning of the 50s to almost 15% at the end of the 60s. So this is the participation rate. That is, what percentage of 18 and 19-year-olds go to university. The dotted line is the overall participation rate. The very dotted line is the male participation rate, and the heavy line is the female participation rate, which, as you see, they didn't even start to measure until 1970, although it was already pretty high, not much below the and I'm going to come back to this chart a couple times. That's easy to understand, isn't it? Please write to Oxford University Press. Luciano O'Flaherty, my wonderful editor, really wants you not to have to look at this graph. I think it explains a lot. I mean, I think you look at that immediately and you think, something's happening here. Sorry, where's the... Something's happening here, then something else is happening here, and then something's happening here. That's what half of my book is about. Okay. But it's the second something that I want to just briefly allude to. At the end of the 60s, Robbins' optimistic projections started to go wrong. Instead of continuing to rise, the proportion of young people going to higher education leveled off, not just temporarily, but for 15 to 20 years. you will read many books about education, you will read many books about the 70s, you will read many books about British society. Almost never is this mentioned. Now, why it happened? That's a subject I can give a whole lecture on alone. Happily for you, I won't. I'll just say that this leveling off in the growth of higher education was also due more to popular demand, or lack of it, than to political initiative. Some policy decisions in the 70s did inhibit the supply of places. Teacher training colleges were closed. The end of the bulge was predicted correctly to mean fewer students, so we need fewer teachers. But on the whole, what caused higher education to level out in the 70s and 80s is that 18 and 19-year-olds stopped wanting it for a wide variety of reasons, having to do mostly, I'd say, with the very uncertain social, cultural, and economic prospects of the period, very much unlike the 50s and 60s. But what I want to focus on for the time being is the return to growth in the later 80s, this third phase. To show again how popular demand flexed its muscles, whatever the politicians wanted or said they wanted. During a period of financial stringency in the 70s, politicians were reasonably happy to go along with diminished demand. Yeah, it meant they have to pay for fewer places at a time when it cost government a lot of money, not just to provide the places, but to pay the fees and grants for the people who filled them. But when Margaret Thatcher came to power, her government showed a more ideological disposition to limit participation in higher education as a matter of policy, rather than simply as a response to demand. Or rather, it was not so much Thatcher and her governments as her education secretary and ideological mentor Keith Joseph, to whom she delegated education policy. Joseph was on record as regretting the Robbins-era expansion of higher education, echoing Kingsley Amos's famous diagnosis that more is worse. Part of his recipe for economic recovery was to ensure that only educational investment that contributed to economic growth would be permitted. And thus he was determined not just to prevent further growth and participation, but actually to drive it down from its current levels, setting a target of 12% of the 18 and 19-year-olds, lower than the current rate that had crept back to 15%. As we'll see, he also tried, equally unsuccessfully, to determine not only who studied, but what they studied. Unfortunately for Joseph, his term in office coincided with an end to the long period of suppressed demand for higher education. I mean, poor man, really. It started out just at the wrong time for him. And for about 18 months, he thought, oh yes, this is great. There's no demand, I can carry on with my nefarious plans. And then all of a sudden, the civil servants started telling him, Sir Keith, I'm afraid it's getting worse. By the mid-1980s, more 18-year-olds were seeking to progress from A-levels to university. And perhaps even more significantly, many older women who didn't figure in those charts that I was showing you, who had foregone higher education in the 70s, who had left school at 18 and got married and had children, were now clamoring to come back. Again, I don't want to spend too much time here explaining why growth resumed in the 80s, a question almost as complicated as why it slackened in the 70s. Changing attitudes to women's roles played a big part. As you might have noticed in this chart earlier, it's from 1979, when women's participation rates have been dropping more than men's. Then it starts to recover, and by the 1980s, it's catching up with the men, and by 1990, it meets them and exceeds them. And that's young people's participation. As I say, older women were also coming back in larger numbers than older men. But other factors, including a renewed faith in education more generally, must also have played a role. And like a lot of people in this audience, I lived through these decades, and so I have my views about why people were willing to go on further in education in the 80s and the 70s. We can maybe discuss this in the Q&A. Joseph was very cross about this, needless to say, especially as it manifested itself mainly in places that he didn't consider value for money, polytechnics, which he viewed as second-rate universities, and in social studies subjects, which he viewed as socialist studies. But as soon as improved demand did begin to register, and especially as middle-class students who wanted places in universities found they could only get them in polytechnics, then Joseph's colleagues in government began to feel uneasy. The civil servants were warning them that the Robbins principle was being breached. And more significantly, the parents of those middle-class students who were being turned away from universities began to protest, and their MPs, mostly backbench Tories, began to feel the heat. In 1985, there were open revolts in the Tory backbenchers when Joseph sought not only to deprive their constituents of places, but to charge them by introducing tuition fees. And as you will notice, he lost that one. Tuition fees were dumped. Now eventually, Thatcher replaced him with Kenneth Baker, who had his own proclivities. He didn't believe that more is worse. He was a technocrat. He wanted more students, but again, doing the right subjects, science and technology. But above all, he had a much keener political sensitivities than Joseph. He knew what his responsibilities were, and he duly turned on the supply tap. Participation rates soared. That's this third phase here. Especially among women at a pace even more rapid than the 1960s. In fact, making up for the stagnation of the 1970s and early 80s. So you'll notice you can draw, this is what Robbins did, a straight line from the 50s to the 90s, and they end up in the same place anyway. And that's why the Robbins predictions, which started out very good, in the middle weren't very good, ended up being almost spot on. When the Treasury cried out for some restraint on student numbers in the mid-90s, the political retribution was almost immediate. And there was a brief period of restriction. You can see it there. Tony Blair started talking education, education, education. The education proved to be the Achilles heel of the Tory governments. And after Blair's landslide election in 1997, he turned the tap back on, set the 50% target, and that's where we are today. Of course, different governments found different ways to pay for this expansion. Thatcher preferred cutting costs, Blair devised tuition fees, Cameron went for the high fee regime. But it's striking that none of these policies, even though they had a direct impact on students' experience and debt levels, made much difference to the, sorry, there's Tony Blair. None of these policies made much difference to the ever-growing participation rate. And this is the participation rate since 2006. And it's, again, if you can draw almost a straight line upwards. And although the introduction of the high fees did cause this strange bump here, it didn't cause a bump because people were deterred from going into higher education. It took a bump because knowing that it was coming, anyone who was going to take a gap year said, no, I'm not going to take a gap year, and went straight in, so the participation went up. And because all those people had already entered, the participation rate in the next year went down, but then the year after that, it almost recovered, and the upward progress continued. So it's again a case where politicians' policies, even ones that charge students £9,000 a year, haven't affected participation rates. I'll end quickly with my third illustration of the power of popular demand. Not here in determining how many people study, but rather in determining what they study. I think this works particularly well as a case where the actual trends are nearly the opposite of what most people think they have been, and that's because most people think the trends have followed politicians' desires, embedded in many, many reports and acts of parliament and speeches, whereas popular demand has consistently foiled these politicians' desires over half a century. So we have to go back to the 50s and ask, what did the minority who took academic examinations, and the even smaller minority who went on to university, actually study? Now, most people, I think, have a picture of 1950s grammar schools and universities as chock-a-block with young people studying the classics, English, and history. Unfortunately, rather backward subjects in a post-war world that desperately needed the white heat of the technological revolution to fuel its economic growth. And actually, cultural products like the History Boys, which although it claims to be set in the 1980s, is really set in the 1950s, only supports this kind of illusion. I think otherwise this picture owes a lot to C.P. Snow's polemic on the two cultures, which complained at the end of the 1950s about the dominance of the arts in British culture and education, and championed a push for more science and technology. It also owes something to the general prevalence of a so-called declinist understanding of the British economy in the post-war years, which portrayed it as backward relative to, well, Germany. In fact, Germany is not necessarily always the best comparator. That's the meaning of my shrug. In fact, so far as education goes, the reverse was the truth. The proportion of students doing science subjects at A-level at university was at its high point around 1960, at exactly the time of the two cultures controversy. That proportion had been growing since the war, and by the 1960s, Britain had, in the words of an OECD report, the greatest concentration on science and technology in higher education, and the biggest proportion of qualified scientists and technologists in relation to population and labor force in Europe. Now that's not what you think of Britain in the 60s, is it? By the end of the 60s, that large share won by science started to go down. This is the proportion of all degrees, that's 50% in science, and this is the proportion in arts and humanities. Everything in between is social studies, basically. You have to ignore this little blip. It's a statistical blip. It's got nothing to do with the actual numbers. You have to see that it's a steady line, basically like that, and a steady line, basically like that. The share of science degrees at its peak in the early 60s shrank continuously from a high point of about 57% of all degrees to a low point of 38% in 2012. And something similar happened in schools. In fact, there were more A-levels awarded in physics in absolute terms in the late 1970s than there were 30 years later, although many, many more people are taking A-levels. Why did this happen? The main drivers were the very same forces that drove the trend to widening participation in exams and education in general. As these numbers expanded, inevitably the new entrants tended to be those from backgrounds with less prior education. Science, and actually modern languages as well, tends to favor those who have been engaged in continuous study for longer. For those on an upward trajectory, it was easier to pick up art subjects, and easier still to pick up the new subjects known as social studies, which were taught less in school and could be taken from scratch at university. The decline in sciences share thus followed more or less the rise in numbers. It slackened off when growth slackened in the 70s, it accelerated when growth accelerated in the 90s. There were other factors, of course, as well. Women's growing participation hit the hard sciences. And both the general culture and the labor market, not only in Britain but across the developed world, were less favorable to science from the 60s onwards, more favorable to self-expression and understandings of self and society. And while in fact the number of jobs specifically requiring science and technology skills was not growing, the number of jobs for which arts and social studies degrees were acceptable, especially in the public sector, was. There doesn't appear to have been a STEM skills shortage, to use the current jargon, at any time since the 1960s. Only about a quarter of science and technology graduates end up in science and technology jobs. Many of the rest go into management, where they are in the same post as arts and social studies graduates, though they tend to be better paid. In short, there were no external incentives for new entrants to higher education to choose science and technology, and many reasons why they would choose art subjects or social studies. And as you'll see from this chart, art subjects retain a level share, while science subjects are in decline, and social studies are growing very rapidly. So we have this continuous 50-year decline in the share of the sciences, and yet over the same 50 years, politicians of all parties have been almost unanimous in their calls for more science students. When the so-called swing away from science began in the 60s, there was almost a panic in the Labour government of the day. And yet the growth in higher education meant that the swing could not be halted. Keith Joseph tried to reverse it, arguing not only that there were too many students, but too many students studying social studies. He particularly disliked sociology. Though you would have thought he would have approved of economics and business and law, which were also growing. But he inaugurated a new policy of government seeking to steer young people into their favorite subject choices, which has really never let up since. I mean, into government's favorite choices. I've lost count of the number of reports and speeches in which government ministers try to steer more students to taking science and technology, of which the latest, the Augur report, came only earlier this year. As you'll see, however, they appear not to have had any effect until 2012. And that's when science began to increase. At that point, the swing finally does go in reverse. Science degrees' share of the total has increased every year since 2012. Of course, two major disruptions occurred around then. The economic crisis of 2008 with the sustained depression of the labor market and the high fee regime of 2010. Government propaganda has continued to pound away. The Augur report has again told us that there is a STEM skills shortage and it has threatened students with fewer places or higher fees for courses of which government disapproves. So far, the politicians have not been emboldened to actually deliver on these threats, but they haven't needed to, as student choices temporarily are going in their favored direction. As the swing back to science suggests, sometimes what politicians say and do does matter. I wouldn't want you to think I'm arguing otherwise. But I do want to argue that in the sphere of education, in particular, there are also powerful social, democratic, and demographic trends that tend to carry politicians along in their wake, despite the rhetoric they use to rationalize or disguise their powerlessness. These trends are less palpable than acts of parliament and politicians' speeches, but that's why we need historians to make visible and audible longer-term trends that politicians and journalists self-interestedly or perhaps just ignorantly skip over. All too often, very short-term political moves are credited with much more force than they deserve. The demand for more and more education has been a fundamental feature of our and others' democracies for several generations now, and I don't really see it yet directly challenged by anxieties about cost, either to students or taxpayers. But that's the point, I'm afraid, where the historian's task ends. We're not that much better at predicting the future than any other informed citizens, though I'm very happy to talk about the future with you now on a level of equality, equal wisdom, or equal ignorance. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter. We dream of a bulb going to dip as we are in universities. People were distracted in Manhattan for various reasons, possibly through the bug, and there's a shortage of 18-year-olds at the moment at the bottom of the dip next year. We have some roving microphones for questions and discussion. I'm going to ask you to catch my eye, please, and I'll direct a microphone towards you. Very important you hold it close so that anyone in the room can hear the question you may have. So one down the front row here, please. And one over here as well. Question or comment? Okay, we'll start with a question.
Or predictions of the future.
Hi, very, very good, thank you. I was interested in what you said about mothers having a high expectation. Now, just a piece of history, I was born in 1953. My mother died when I was 11, and I went to a secondary modern school and left at 15 and went down the pit. But, do you think there's any effect in sort of single-parent families or high divorce rates, etc.?
It's not so much that as the fact that decisions about children's education were more often made by mothers than fathers. And there had been a struggle, really, between fathers' desire to get their sons into their own jobs, through apprenticeship especially, and mothers' desire for their sons to have clean jobs that would provide them better opportunities. And I think that struggle evens out a little bit in the post-war world, as fathers come around to the view that actually not only are their sons unlikely to have the same jobs as they, I mean, obviously mining is very exceptional. There's an extremely strong tradition of men handing on jobs to their sons. But in other parts of the economy, I think fewer men expected their sons to, I mean, I know fewer men expected their sons to go into their jobs, but also fewer men wanted their sons to go into their jobs. I think there was this feeling that the welfare state and greater occupational freedom was offering their sons more opportunities. It was easier, of course, for mothers to get their daughters into education, but then their daughters would tend to leave school earlier and get married, and so their mother's promotion was not something, even if they had intended it to have occupational effects, tended not to, because marriage tended to short circuit them. So I think there is a changing balance within the family, and that there's a more equal and more cooperative relation between mothers and fathers in deciding the educational future of their children, but also, an awareness of the greater opportunities.
A question here, microphone's approaching you. Okay.
Hello. Do you think there's a possibility that the rise in attendance at universities is related to the competition between universities and their lowering entry grades in order to get students to their university as opposed to others? And is it not possible that because people are coming with lower and lower quality degrees because of that, people are going to lose heart about the value of a degree, and therefore it'll start going down again?
Yeah, well, actually, there's a lot of different ideas packed into that very short and sweet question. I'll try to briefly address a number of them. I mean, first of all, one of the interesting things is that the so-called lifting of student number controls, which happened around there, actually about there, hasn't had any effect on participation rates. So that this is just another case where government policies haven't made any difference. What happens with the lifting of student number controls, which now allows every university to recruit as many students as they want and can. What happens then, I'm sure people involved here in student recruitment are keenly aware of this, is that there's competition between universities for the students. So their number of students is continuing to grow, but some universities are able to expand much more rapidly than others. And there is some debate, of course, about whether some universities, I'm sure this never happens here, are doing illegitimate things to attract more students, like unconditional offers. We know that's a big problem right now. That is, they say we don't care what your exam results are, we'll give you a place anyway. And actually lowering their offer below their stated offer. I mean, there's lots of examples of that. You know, oh, we only take 3 A's, but in fact we take 3 C's. But that's not, I wouldn't say that's affecting the quality of the overall population. That's just meaning that some of the more elite universities are maybe making concessions on quality in order to increase their numbers, just because they have an imperial desire to grow. And of course, universities further down the ladder are hurting, and they're not able to recruit the students with the lower attainment levels that they had relying on. Whether there's been a decline in standards overall, it's very hard to say. I mean, the proportion where university has expanded from 2% before the war to 5% after the war to 15% in the 60s to 50% today. At every stage, of course, there were people who said, it's only 2%, only 5%, only 15% can ever benefit from university education. And you have to look back, just as an historian, I look back on that with a degree of skepticism, because they were almost immediately belied. Again, it's very hard to compare, and also that we do now think that more people should go on to university, and we accept that there are universities of many different qualities, and that some of them offer different kinds of subjects, and they are appealing to different constituencies, and some of them have much higher attainment standards than others. And we just accept that, because we think it's a good thing that 50% go to universities. And I teach at Cambridge University. I don't feel that the quality of my students is in any way affected by the fact that I used to teach at the City of London Polytechnic. I don't feel that the quality of my students at Cambridge is in any way altered by the fact that there are students going to the University of North London, as it now is, who would never have gone to university at all 20 or 30 years ago. That hasn't affected the elite students. It's just broadened the scope. I mean, there are always debates about whether O-levels, or GCSEs as they now are, and A-levels, have dumbed down in order to suck in more people. I can tell you some anecdotes about that. It's very hard to say. I think we live in a different society. We measure things by different measures, and we measure different things. I mean, when I took, although I'm American, I was here in 1971, and I took an O-level in maths, and most of the O-level was about using a slide rule. That would really be very useful to my son, who took the GCSE and used a calculator.
I remember having a textbook telling me to use a slide rule with school,
Yeah.
and I'd never seen one.
No.
Lots of questions. Question here
Technology.
at the back, please.
Given the very considerable increase in student numbers as a percentage of the population, has the quality of the graduate jobs they're able to get decreased, or do they still get professional and managerial jobs like the consequence?
That's a really interesting question, and that's connected to the last one, but it's different. So it depends who you ask. I mean, economists have their views on this, sociologists have other views. I think my answer would be a version of my answer to the last question, which is the nature of the job market has changed remarkably. I mean, what is a graduate job? I mean, it used to be that a graduate job was only the top 10% of jobs, just by definition. So it was only a higher managerial. In the 1960s, law was not a graduate occupation, accountancy was not a graduate occupation. But as soon as the educational population began to grow, lawyers and accountants, when they were taking on new recruits, found that they couldn't get the people they wanted at 18 anymore. They had to get 21-year-olds, because all the good students were going to university. So all of a sudden, law and accountancy became graduate jobs. And now we're in a situation when half the population goes to university. We've seen this, I'd have to go all the way back, I think. We've seen this huge growth in the professional and managerial roles. But you know, going to university is characteristic of 50% of the population, and 40% of the jobs are professional and managerial, or actually more than that now, because this reflects the older workforce. So, you know, I'd say roughly the credential has grown with the changing labor market, but I also think that we just don't define a graduate job in the same way anymore. And also, I don't think, maybe you feel differently, but I don't think that actually people should be educated either at 11 or 16 or at 21 simply for their future occupation. I think they're being educated to be functioning members of society, they're being educated to be citizens, and a lot of the skills they acquire are kind of irrelevant to their jobs, but very relevant to those other things. And this is why, for example, only 25% of STEM graduates go into jobs that require STEM skills. 75% of all graduate jobs do not specify a degree subject. So it doesn't really matter what degree subject you did, we just want a more educated populace to do the kinds of things that modern people of the 21st century need to do, both economically and socially, and culturally.
Can I ask if you could go back to your last slide?
Oh, of course it would be the last one. Yeah. Oop, that one.
I'm not quite sure what the what the vertical scale is.
Oh, that's just percent. So that's 50.
When you say percent
Percent of all
has
degrees.
been made 10%.
Sorry?
I mean, that's not a percentage sign up there. That 0.1%.
No, I know, but sorry, that's just the way that it's been put into the spreadsheet. 0.5 means 50% for the purposes of, 0.5 is 50%. It's half.
Well, yeah, if you put it that way, yes.
But anyway, so that's a percentage of all degrees, and it's and those are arts and humanities, and those are science, and they don't add up to 100, so they don't
I
add
was
up to
going to ask what is the missing?
It's social studies. It's all those different, I said this a couple times, it's all the different subjects that we call social studies, and that means business, law, communications, and social science.
And have they shown the same trend?
So you'll see, if you could work it out for yourself, I mean, maybe I should have put them on this chart as well, but obviously science and humanities are both declining until around 2000, and that means that social studies are growing, right, by logically. So here, we'll take here, arts and humanities about 22%, science at about 40%. That means 40%, 38% are social studies. So obviously they've grown quite dramatically, and generally speaking, they have remained steady as everything else has since then, except that now that science is going up and the arts and humanities are going down, so social studies are remaining the same, but this relationship has changed.
And the total number of people, rather than the percentage, follows exactly the same shape?
Well, no, because the total number of people, the reason why I use share is the total number of people getting these degrees depends on demography. That is, depends how many 18-year-olds there are in the country. And that's why I think this is a much better way of measuring change over time, because it controls the demography. That is, it says it doesn't matter what the birth rate happens to be, but of those 18-year-olds that there are, 60% do this and 40% do that.
Any questions at the back? David?
So I think your answer to the last question got quite close to what I was interested in, but I'll come out again with the question as to whether your research includes looking at things through the lens of what is jargonized or called lifelong learning, and how you would deal with that. And I'm actually thinking of what has happened north of the border, because your titles talk about Britain, but there are actually quite substantial changes north of the border, as happens in England, and that argument that education, which you were close to, have been intrinsically valuable, whereas the argument in England that education is instrumentally valuable is
I mean, again, I think you're repeating what the politicians are saying.
Sorry?
I think you're repeating what politicians are saying. I mean, I'm not sure that the English people necessarily have a more instrumental view. And in fact, we have a lot of social survey data which say that they tend not to be more instrumental than Scots. But I'll answer your question. I mean, first of all, a lot of this data is UK-wide. This is UK-wide. Obviously, when I talk about A levels and O levels, that's England, but I try to also talk about O grade and S grade, and in my book I do. I do try to compare England and Scotland and Wales, not Northern Ireland for reasons that I could explain. And there are some differences. For example, obviously comprehensivization is earlier and faster in Scotland and Wales than it is in England, though not a lot, but it is earlier and faster. In other respects, there's a lot of similarity. For example, the swing away from science that I was illustrating here, that is this decline in science during the 60s and 70s, which was a source of much concern to politicians. One argument was that it had to do with early specialization. That in England, you're already deciding on your O-level subjects at 14, and then you're deciding on your degree subject at 18, whereas in Scotland, of course, it's a later specialization system. And surely that would allow for a higher uptake of science because more mature students would see the virtues of science. And that was an argument that was made until the statisticians showed that the swing away from science was happening at exactly the same time to exactly the same degree in Scotland and England. So it had nothing to do with early specialization. And that meant that we had to start looking at these other factors which I mentioned. I'll just mention answer one other part of your question. Mature students, it is an important subject. I did mention it at the point where numerically it's really significant, which is mature women returning to higher education in the 1980s. But actually, as a proportion of the total, it's relatively small. I mean, of degree qualification, it's relatively small. And I try to confine myself to using that measure just so that I can make comparisons over time.
Thank you for your presentation, Professor. I'm having a very uncomfortable aha moment. Looking at the graph which shows in the 70s the stagnation with people going to university, which you said what the minister was trying to push down.
Well, Keith Joseph did, yeah, in the 80s, yes.
Well, I went to a grammar school in the 70s, early 70s, and back in those days it was very much the A students, the ones expected to go to university. For the rest of us, there was no suggestion, no support, no idea whatsoever that we could go on and go to university. I mean, we were bloody bright.
Especially the girls.
Wow, so was that the attitude that you're just girls and you're all going to get married and have babies? No. Or was it something at a higher level? Was it Kent County Council? Was it the government trickling down, saying, no, don't encourage
See, I mean, that's a good question and it's a really complicated one, and I can't do it full justice, but I think I would just apply my general argument, which is that sometimes politicians, whether at the local or the national level, have an incentive to try to manipulate demand for education. And in the 70s, all politicians had an incentive to spend as little money as they possibly could because there was a financial crisis. But popular demand actually wins the day eventually in almost all cases. And all of those bright grammar school and indeed comprehensive school girls, because most by the 70s, half of all children were in comprehensives, those bright grammar school girls, bright comprehensive school girls, who for whatever reason or another didn't go on to higher education in the 70s, did in the 80s, because they got through their early child rearing years and they found themselves frustrated and bored and unrealized, really, and they went back to education, sometimes against the wishes of their husbands, sometimes against the wishes of the county council, sometimes against the wishes of the Department of Education and Science. But that was the problem that Keith Joseph faced. All these women wanted to go to polytechnics and study social studies, and it was horrifying. But in the end, he found he could not go to his backbenchers and say, I'm sorry, your constituents want to go to university, but we're not going to pay for it.
Right in front row.
Peter, thank you very much. That's a fantastic presentation, really, really interesting. I'm Liz Todd, Professor of Education here. I was really interested in your analysis of grammar schools and secondary modern schools, and that happening really despite the government's actions and the parents and there's a kind of movement of what happened to populations and their choices. So now think about now. We've had in the last 9 years a big experiment that has not been wanted, as far as my analysis is concerned. It's not been something that's been wanted by parents. The big experiment into academies and free schools and the kind of atomisation and sort of privatisation, in a way, of schools, although they're still free. So, or free-ish. I'm just wondering if you were to project into the future and look back, so in 20 years' time, and you're looking back at the last 9 years, what would you be telling us about this big experiment?
Yeah, well, that's obviously a very good question, and an important one. And I do, chapters 6 and 7 do discuss it at great length. On the other hand, I have to say I'm a little bit shyer about pronouncing on the basis of history about present-day events, and also, especially as I said, about the future, because, as they say in the investment guides, past performance is no indicator of future returns. What I would say is this: I actually don't think parents care an awful lot about the administrative organization of schools, and I think a lot of parents haven't noticed very much all of this ridiculous. I mean, I agree with you. This ridiculous juggling of school governance that's been going on since the late 80s, and it's led to academization. I don't think a lot of parents have noticed it. They mostly still prefer their neighborhood school. They mostly still get their neighborhood school. There's a little bit more choice than there used to be. I think parents do want that, and all the evidence is the survey evidence from the 80s and 90s and subsequently is that parents want more say in their children's schooling, and they don't much care how they get it. I think the more interesting experiment, well, not more interesting because that is interesting, but I think the more consequential experiment is, of course, the experiment about bringing back grammar schools, which in fact the government has not yet been quite willing to do, knowing that it's, as one Tory MP recently described it, the third rail of British electoral politics. It will be very interesting to see after the next election, if we get a Conservative majority government, which we might, whether this promise to extend grammar education is delivered on, because of course what that will do is once again tell a Democratic electorate that only 25% of their children are good enough for the best schools. And that didn't work the last time around. And it's very hard to envisage, in the current state of society, a selection process which would not be highly socially skewed, because all of these academic selection processes are tantamount to social selection processes. I mean, the reason why working class parents were more unhappy about grammar schools than middle class parents in the 50s and 60s is that they didn't get in and the middle class parents' children did. And that almost certainly reproduced itself. So I think that any government that commits itself to returning to widespread selection is storing up trouble. But I don't really think that as I say, the administrative organization matters very much. The other thing that could be said is that local authorities by the 70s were not doing a very good job. And in fact, for various reasons in the 70s, local authorities were becoming less and less relevant in people's lives. There was the big reorganization that a lot of you here will remember in 71. Again, survey data shows that local education authorities were in pretty poor odor by the time Thatcher came to power. So that when she took this very dramatic stab at dissolving them, actually a lot of people hardly noticed.
Over here, Chloe?
Hi, I'm a current student at Newcastle University, and something that I've discussed quite recently with a lot of my peers is the topic of tuition fees. Do you believe that the increase in tuition fees will have a long-term impact on how many people apply to university? And also, do you think that if different institutions charge varying rates of tuition fees, that would have an impact on the sorts of people that apply to university, so people that are referred to as like from widening backgrounds? For example, if former polytechnics charge lower tuition fees, do you believe that would increase the number of people that apply to university?
So, good questions. I mean, I gave little hints about some of them. I mean, so far, tuition fees haven't made any difference on widening participation. And of course, we can do counterfactual. How many more people would be participating if tuition fees would have been kept low? It's hard to say. But these trends are very long-term, and they don't seem to change very much. And even tuition fees didn't change them. So that we hit the 50% target regardless of the high tuition fees. So in terms of widening participation as a whole, and also going back to the questions earlier about the labor market, I mean, everyone knows now that, university education is a valuable thing in a very tight labor market. So, and also there's what the sociologists call a peer group effect, in that if your friends are going to university, you want to go to university without really thinking about why and what it's for. So I don't think it will affect overall participation rates, and it hasn't yet. But what it might do is it might stratify more, and that's where differential fees, I think, would be very damaging, because I think, part of the problem is that when the government looks at differential fees, they can't decide whether, for example, science subjects, which they want to encourage, should have higher fees because they lead to higher incomes, or whether they should have lower fees because they want more students to take them. And actually that was the interesting thing when the Auger report addressed differential fees. It said in a very lordly fashion, oh, well, obviously differential fees would be the way forward, but we're not going to do it yet, because we're going to give universities a few years to get their act in order. But in fact, what they really meant was, we can't solve that conundrum, whether we want higher fees for science courses or lower fees for science courses. So I think they're stuck in a bind there. The other thing government, of course, wants to do is it wants to provide higher fees for all degrees which pay off in higher graduate incomes. And they want to do that for a very simple reason, which is that the public expenditure will go down if, because of the way that the tuition fee regime works, the public expenditure will go down if more people take higher earning jobs and pay back more of their loan. But that depends on how you measure high earning graduates, because if you just use the raw data, what you mean are privileged graduates from privileged universities who go to work in privileged places like the Southeast. Universities in the Northeast will get screwed if you don't control for the fact that the labor market here provides lower wages. It doesn't mean that a Newcastle university degree is any, or Sunderland or Northumbria university degree is any worse than a degree from the Midlands or from the South. It just means that the people who go to the labor market are getting paid less because it's a low-wage area. And so that, if you introduce that without sufficient controls, it would lead to terrible inequalities. And honestly, I cannot see government solving that conundrum either. They would have to put so many controls on that the result would be almost pointless. Because actually, if you have to control for labor market and region and prior attainment and so on, actually there isn't much difference between graduates' incomes, except at the extremes. So I think that any government that tries to do that is going to run into some really, really stiff opposition, and it's going to tangle itself up in knots. And that's why even the Auger report, which was supposed to be the government's solution to this question, said not touching that one.
We have three final questions. First one being over here, please.
I wonder if you could just say a bit more about the graph you had from 1950 to 2000. Yeah. About that very sudden, sharp increase. There was the one before that showed the trends. That one there. We can sort of understand the sort of gradual trends and then slow down, but what were the main triggers that really quite steep increase from 89 and the 90s there? Was there anything in particular that caused that?
Yeah, well, I think I said, this is something that's very complicated, and there's so many different things happening in the 70s and 80s. On the one hand, to suppress demand, and then to unleash it. I mean, one of the things that's happening, and that's not what this is about, because this is 18 and 19-year-olds, is mature women coming back. So they come back in very large numbers. And that has to do with changing gender roles and women's re-entry into the labor market. 18 and 19-year-olds, I mean, they had been artificially suppressed in the late 70s and early 80s by Keith Joseph's policy of trying to reduce rates. And he tried all sorts of funding tricks to try to keep qualified people who wanted to go into higher education from doing so. And that was suddenly released in 85. And that, I think, explains a good deal of, but by no means all, of the surge. You're absolutely right. As I said, there is overall a straight line. And so there's a long-term trend. And if I were a statistician, I might have had the temerity to just draw the line which shows the overall mean. But in fact, I'm a historian, so I want to say something's happening in the 70s, something's happening in the 80s. And as I say, it's very complicated. Lots of things are happening at once. I do think there's a returning confidence in higher education. One of the things that's happened in the 70s is that people still take A-levels. They just don't go on to higher education. So something has made higher education look scary. Some of it has to do with student unrest. Some of it has to do with middle-class fathers not wanting their daughters to go to these scary places. But the student unrest is pretty much over by the late 70s, and I think universities start to look like safer places. But so many factors that are. Chapter 5.
And just a moment,
I just wanted to take issue with you saying that parents didn't care about academisation, and certainly a lot of the parents I know do care a lot about academisation because they see it as being backdoor grammar schools. One of the things I wanted to ask you was the impact of education grants which were given by local authorities to students from poor families. In the 1960s, certainly, I think they were given before that, to encourage them to stay on in secondary education.
Yeah.
I wondered if you'd looked at that.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that with the loss of those education grants, I can't see that aggregating the figures is going to tell you a lot about who is actually going to university, because as far as I'm concerned, what I see now is a further stratification of working class children not being able to go to university. In our area we have children who have to be given a breakfast at school before they start learning. And just as an example, this university does science lectures for secondary school children in January. This year I came to it. I can tell you who was there. It was the academy schools. It was the Royal Grammar School. It was Central High School. It was concerned grandparents like me who were bringing their kids along. But it was not the areas like Medwell and the inner city areas where there is great deprivation. There were so few state school children here, I can't tell you. So I don't think that a child from a deprived area has got a better chance of getting to university than they had in the 1950s, to be quite frank. And I wondered, as a sort of second question, whether you had taken into account the effect of the Open University.
Sorry?
Whether you had taken into account the effect of the university.
Yeah. Okay, I'll run through those very quickly. There were 4 points. The first one was about parents and academies. All I can say is that social survey data, which covers the whole country, suggests that although parents were worried about selection, and they didn't want the kind of choice that they were being offered between schools that were very far away from them, because that was not much use to them, once they were assured that academies were just actually going to be their own comprehensive schools with new names, their interest ebbed away. And in fact, most secondary schools are now academies. So in fact, it's not possible. I mean, a very large proportion of secondary schools, I think it's now over 3/4. So yes, they tended to be, actually, in the first phase of academies, they tended to be the most deprived schools, because the new Labour policy was to focus academies only on the most deprived schools. And then it began to spread out under the Conservative government, the coalition government, to all schools. But basically, all comprehensives are academies now, or not all, but a very large proportion. And I don't think parents necessarily can see much difference. Educational maintenance allowances, very important in the 50s and 60s, actually. But a bewildering variety of policies. Every local authority did something different, so it's very hard to generalize. But I think, yes, that was part of that welfare state promise that, if you wanted to and you were clever enough, if you should pass exams, you could stay on in school to 16 to 18 and go to university. And I think that did play a role in expanding participation. As did the OU, although statistically it's not a very large proportion. And one of the things that the OU discovered about its own students is that, again, it was a way for mature women to get degrees who had been not denied them. In the 70s, that was an important factor. But increasingly, they found that more and more of the OU intake was coming from people who already had high educational qualifications. So it doesn't add very much to widening participation. And that raised your last point about widening participation in universities. The gap between the social classes has not changed at all in the last 30 years. It's been very, very steady. And what that means, and this doesn't mean that we live in an equal society. To the contrary, we have always lived in an unequal society, but it's not in this respect. It is in other respects. You mentioned some other things. But in this respect, it is not more unequal than it was. And it's interesting because politicians, again, they fall into a statistical fallacy called the base rate fallacy. They see that that the participation rate, let's say, of children from the bottom 3 social classes has risen from, I don't know, 10 to 20%. And they think they say that's a doubling of the participation. Well, yes, but it's only gone up 10%, from 10 to 20. And the participation rate for the most privileged kids has also gone up by 10%. I mean, by 10 percentage points, from 75 to 85% or something like that. So in fact, the gap between the two groups hasn't changed at all. And although politicians will sometimes make you think that in fact less advantaged children are participating at higher levels because starting from a very low base, their rate of growth is faster. But I mean, all I can do is tell you what the sociologists and the economists report from the statistical data we have, which is that participation rates in all groups have been moving pretty much at the same pace upwards in the last 30 years.
I'm sorry for those I can't come to. I'm going to be here past 7, so there's just one last question at the front.
Sorry, could we look at the last graph again, please? That's the one. I want to preface the question. The question is going to be, where do management studies and business studies fit in that? Because some are going to say there are signs. I, for one, am going to dispute that to my dying day. My question is this. I never thought I would publicly defend Keith Joseph.
But you're a murmur of discontent in the room.
Keith Joseph was determined to improve Britain's competitiveness. And part of that was to encourage business and management education, and he set up a small group, the Savoy Group, to try and do it. What happened was that academia effectively took it against Sicky's will. He wanted much more business input and control, and it's something which academia took largely unto itself. Now, I'm not seeking to refight that wall. But I find that graph, those two graphs, fundamentally misleading, because the C.P. Snow argument was that we've got two cultures, and you do science and you do arts. Well, that's perpetuating it. I understand that the competitive local university, that its highest number of undergraduate students are in business studies, and that they had to put on a whole extra stream last year to accommodate. Now, it seems to me that popular demand now is very simple. Since 2008, and I speak here as somebody who spent more time running a business and in business than I did as an academic, I've done both. People simply want to maintain their standard of living. They are going to business schools here around the world to try and make some money. That's the point. That's the driving point. So, thank you for the most brilliant lecture. I've enjoyed every bit of it. But I do think that this is wholly misleading.
All right. Well, I have already said, I think 3 times, that, but I'll say it again, that social studies, which includes business and management, I said that, and communications, and the social sciences, all of those groups, by the way, have grown very dramatically. Business not more than the others. Social sciences, I mean, sociology and psychology are the 2 most rapidly growing subjects at A level today. And they're very rapidly growing at university level as well. So social sciences, business and management, law, and communications, they're all growing very rapidly, and that's why, if you sum up these 2 lines, you get a figure that grows over time. Absolutely. It hasn't grown in the last 20 years, but it grew in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Absolutely. And business management was part of it. I absolutely agree with that. Along with these other things, like communications and social science and law. Whether, in fact, I mean, business is a fairly large subject group now, but it's not a huge one. It's not dwarfing everyone else. And again, all I can do is report back to you what the survey data tell us. And I would have thought, as those of us who are university teachers know this from our own experience. 18-year-olds do not choose a degree subject based on future employment options on the whole. They choose a degree subject based on what they were good at school and what they liked. And 21-year-olds even, when the Warwick University did a survey, a national survey of 21-year-olds not that long ago, and asked them about it, at both at 18 and at 21, the same students, why they chose their subject and how it had changed over the terms of years that they were in university. And even at 21, not very many of them were thinking very clearly about a connection between their subject and their career. And as I said, 75% of all jobs do not specify a degree subject. So students are being told by employers that it actually doesn't really matter what you study. We just want to make sure that, well, what they do say is we want you to have gone to a good university and have got a good degree. That has its pitfalls as well. But those are the only things that employers consistently say to 21-year-olds that might steer them. So I don't want to depreciate business. I do think it's, and I've written, by the way, an article entirely about the social studies and how they grow in this period. And I can now see that maybe I should tell my publisher to have to rewrite this graphic. See that I should put in a social studies line and it would go up and then it would scuttle off. But again, that would conflate lots of very different subjects, of which, by the way, arts and humanities conflates the traditional humanities with creative arts subjects, which also grew very rapidly in this period. You didn't do creative arts at university before 1992. So there's been lots of changes, of which management and business studies is one.
Well, I actually had some questions, but they weren't needed. We've been another hour quite easily, which is the sign of a stimulating talk. So would you join me in thanking our speakers?